we're going to play a game, right? Or you're going to play a game. And where this game comes from, I do a lot of work with regions and communities and different places in the world as they wrestle with the future. And one of the things I keep finding over and over is that thinking about the future, discussing the future, kind of trying to get your brain into the future is actually quite a difficult exercise for a lot of people, particularly at the level of the average person in a community. So one of the things that I've been working on is different tools that will allow people to think about the future in an engaging and enjoyable manner. So as you probably know, and I know, playing games is pretty much good stuff for most people, right? So I've developed this concept of the futures game. And you're going to now get to play the futures game that's set in a part of the world that I come from, which is Western Australia. So let me set this game up for you, right? So let me give you the context. So the game is set in the state called Western Australia. So to give you a lesson in geography very quickly, Western Australia is a third of the continent of Australia, so it's the western third. In terms of size, Australia is almost identical to the lower 48 states of America in square miles. So it's in that kind of size, right? So you can imagine the western third of Australia is like the western third of the US. The big difference in Western Australia is there's only about 2 million people live there. And about 1.6 or 7 of them live in or around the capital city, Perth. So I know you guys think you're in the vast kind of reaches, low population, etc., right? In this part of Canada or in Canada. Pretty much nobody lives in that part of Western Australia. It's pretty much unoccupied. The area that you're going to be working with, and you're going to make a set of critical decisions about the future, is what we call the wheat belt, which is there, the Avon River Basin. It's blowing up there. You can see it's going to be a flat landscape. It's a series of small towns. It's an agricultural setting, right? So I want to explain to you, and I want to show you on the screen here, various features of this part of the world that you're going to be dealing with. What I should say is from this point forward, consider at your tables, you are the people who are the leaders in this part of the world. So you are both charged with the responsibility and the accountability for a series of critical decisions that are going to shape the future of this very part of the world. So from now on, don't have this be an academic exercise, have this be a real exercise, and you're in the hot seat. Somebody talked about being in the hot seat, right? You're it now. For how many people was this a enjoyable exercise, playing the game? You found it enjoyable, challenging? Okay, good. Who was frustrated or didn't like it?
I hate games.
You hate games, right? And you guys, did you guys enjoy it, or?
I enjoyed it.
You enjoyed it? Okay. Yeah? All right, good. So I want to talk a bit about where this came from, right? So we were facing a situation we really started to notice it sort of about 5, 6, 7 years ago, right? Which was that there were a number of issues in our region that clearly weren't going well in the wheat belt region. So we had the environmental issue that was starting to really raise its head, left a whole question about the future. We also had some problems with some of our smaller towns starting to decline, and we were really wrestling with how do we deal with this, right? I think there's a very powerful analogy actually to your region at this point in time with some environmental issues. So the pine beetle and the potential impact of that, but also how do your communities deal with this? How do you move forward? How do you start to grapple with what could be, and probably is going to be, a very profound change to your economy and to your society as well as your environment? So we started this process where we drew together a whole range of kind of stakeholders or thought leaders in the region, and we conducted what we call a scenario planning process, which I'm going to explain to you, and we titled the exercise Confronting Our Future, because that's essentially what we wanted to do, was to confront the future. And we went through a scenario planning process, which I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but there's a few things I want to point out, was that with this group of thoughtful leaders from across the region, the first question we asked people was, if you think about the future, looking out sort of like 10, 20, 30, 40 years, what do you think are the key things that are going to shape the future? Or what are the forces or the drivers that are shaping the future of your region? And this was the list that people came up with. And you can see that there's everything there from alternate fuels to, I don't know, human capacity building, global climate change, demographics, There's agricultural issues like plant production, there's policy and governance, there's impact of tourism, there's water, there's a whole raft of things, right? Now, if we did this exercise in your region, you would come up with a list of drivers that would probably look something like that, right? You would have your own version of them, right? Now, the question I have for a lot of people is, this is relatively the easy part, coming up with this list of drivers. You know, most groups can do that pretty quick. But if you're a regional leader, how the hell do you reconcile that? How do you make sense of things as diverse as human capacity, global climate change, impact of tourism, water? I mean, every one of those topics is an important issue in its own right. You can have a 5-day conference about any one of those and scratch the surface, quite literally. But as leaders, you're asked to reconcile and make sense of that. And I think that's where there's a breakdown often in regional leadership. Because I think for most people, it's extraordinarily difficult to try and make sense of a disparate set of issues that are all important like that. And in fact, I think a lot of people then just revert back to, okay, let's just keep doing what we were doing or using the framework we were for our decision making. So what we tried to do with scenario planning is to make sense of this in terms of how this could shape the future. So we got each person in the workshop to rank each driver on a scale of importance and uncertainty. I'm not going to go into this other than to say what we're looking for is the drivers that were up in this top right-hand corner. The ones that have a high degree of importance for the future, but there's also a high degree of uncertainty. In other words, we don't quite know how it's going to play out. And we were looking for clusters of drivers, and we identified, as you can see, 2 clusters. There's one that says new industries and markets, and one that says environmental change. So we're trying to look for kind of core groups of things that were going to be very potent in terms of determining which way the future might unfold. And then in scenario planning, what we do is, because we're trying to create different plausible views of the future. So if you think about your region right now, and you think about the future, well, the future for starters hasn't happened, right? But it could unfold in different ways. There actually is no single future in front of you. There's really a range of different ways the future could unfold. There could be different things that could have your future turn out in quite different ways. And that's what this process tries to get to. So we put environmental change on this axis and we put new industries and markets on this axis. This end, we're asking the question, which is, what would happen if the environment got better in the wheat belt? So we have an environmental issue, but what if we found the way and made the investments to improve that environmental landscape in those conditions? And on this end, it's saying, well, what if we just don't worry about it? We let salinity run its course and we just learn to live with it. Then on this axis, it's, well, what if, down this end, it's new industries and markets, and it says, well, what if we don't worry about that? What if we just say we're good at growing wheat and we keep doing that, right? On that end, it's saying, well, what if new industries and new markets emerge and we start to develop diversity in our economy? So it creates 4 distinctly different versions of the future when you play this out over time. So in this workshop process, we had groups work on describing in detail how these different futures could look 10, 20, 30 years down the track. And they had to come up with a name for each future. So, for example, the grain and drain future is where the environment doesn't get better. In fact, the environment continues to decline, and there's no new markets or industries. So it's still a wheat belt. And in fact, the grain and drain stands for the way people deal with the environment is they keep digging those ditches, drain the salt water away, still keep growing wheat, and so on, right? So grain and drain. And then there's saline growth, which is where there's new industries and markets. So the environment gets worse, so it gets more saline, but people find the way to adapt to that. So people find the industries and the ways to create a vibrant economy on top of a saline environment. Now, I used the example early on about how in this part of the world some people, for example, are growing perennial tree crops and then using the timber from that to make charcoal and to fire power stations. You know, another industry that started in the wheat belt actually is, trout, fish, fresh water, right? What they've discovered is that they grow out very well in salt water. So they won't reproduce, but they'll grow very well. And so there's this whole inland trout fish industry started on saline water ponds associated with that saline farmland. So some wheat farmers are now growing fish as well, as ridiculous as that seems, right? the land care bounty is a future where the environment gets better, but it's still basically a wheat belt. So people find the actions to, to reverse salinity, but they still basically are farming broadacre stuff. And then harmony with prosperity is where those two things come together, where the environment gets better, but there's also diversification in the economy, right? But the connection to the game, right, is one of the things we found is that detailed regional planning is often very powerful for the people who do it. But we had 80 people in that planning process, and they walked out of there with a whole different insight into the future. However, there's a very poor transference of that to the average person in the community. So we developed the game as a way to take the lessons out very quickly to people. So how the endpoints in the game, so we use the scenarios to create the endpoints. So if you finished in 2030A, you ended up in what we call the grain and drain scenario. If you end up in 2030B, you end up in what we call the saline growth scenario. If you end up in 2030C, it's a mixture of these two because we made a fifth one. 2030D was the land care bounty scenario, and 2030E is the harmony with prosperity scenario. Now, I'm going to go through with you in a minute where you ended up relative to this, right? But what was fascinating is we took this game out across the wheat belt, and we played it literally with hundreds and hundreds of people. So high school students, elected officials, community people, all over the place, right? And like you, they ended up in a whole range of different endpoints. But when we asked people, if you look at the different scenarios that we saw as possible for the future, which scenario would most represent the future you would aspire to have for your region? 100%. This was just so fascinating for us, right? It was like literally every person unanimously, independently said that harmony with prosperity and the characteristics that go with that reflect the future that they most wanted. However, many teams, including elected officials and decision makers, took their region into 2030A, diametrically opposed to what would be their preferred scenario for the future. So there was this, what people started to confront was this disconnect between where they might want to end up and the decision-making framework they were using and where that was actually going to lead them to. 2030C, which is where groups 3, 5, 1 and 2 ended, this is a pretty balanced outcome. So you've got a reasonable environmental outcome. So salinity's actually been held in its tracks. You can see it hasn't expanded. There's been a lot of planting of perennial vegetation, which is this speckledy stuff here. You get a little bit of economic diversification. You get some export grazing, some bush foods export centre. Do you know what bush foods are? It's like the native food, the native plants, nuts and stuff that people harvest. Town populations are okay, and they've formed together into a single shire. So we've now gone from 3 different shires to 1 shire. 2030D, which is where groups 4, 7 and 6 ended up, this represents land care bounty. So you can see there's a really good environmental outcome. So salinity's contracted back, so you've actually reversed salinity. In fact, fresh water has now returned to some of the creek systems. You can see here some of the freshwater lakes have recovered. There's also some economic development around it, so you have some natural resource management centres. You have a pretty good outcome in your regional centres. You have some industries that are developed around the perennial vegetation, some wood processing, alternate fuel stuff. A few downshifters move in because we think a community like this, in this scenario, would be quite attractive for people who are looking for that lifestyle change. This is a fairly optimistic kind of community. People are doing good things. They're kind of helping recover the environment, all that stuff that, warm, fuzzy stuff that people like. And it's what we're calling a zone here. So it's more than a shire. We're saying that people are starting to get their act together, so there would be a devolution of state government responsibility to the zone, like your regional government, right? Or your regional districts, right? And then 2030E, which is none of you got here, represents the aspirational future for the people who live here. You've got a very good environmental outcome, salinity's contracted, you've got farm diversification, you've got a university campus, so you've got 3 communities, and they're all strong, and they've all found their own little particular niche, right? All right, good. So with that in the background, I want to give you just a chance in your groups just to debrief on your thoughts about these different endpoints, about You know, where you went versus where you could have gone. You know, what do you think about the future you created? Because none of you actually created the preferred future that these guys want, right? So what do you think was, what was guiding your decision making as you played this game? So, all right, good. So we're gonna, for lunch, right? So trust you found that enjoyable. Trust you got some kind of insights into the future about that. Gary's gonna leverage off that. We're gonna talk more about the kind of leadership component of how you, or what kind of leadership you need to steer a region forward in the future. We're going to do that after lunch.